Welcome to this video for Chapter 5 of the iOS development book for absolute beginners. In this chapter, we're going to go a little bit deeper than the Hello World apps that you've been building and look at things called patterns and delegates. Patterns and delegates will be explained in a lot of detail in the book in Chapter 5 itself, and in this video I'm just going to go through the sample of the book that demonstrates the patterns and delegates. So let's get started by building a new Xcode project. I'm going to say create a new Xcode project. I'm going to bring Xcode up into the window and just say I'm creating a single view application. I'm going to call this single view application text field demo. You can leave the organization name, the company identifier as they are. You can change them if you like, but just be sure to leave the class prefix empty and make the device to be iPhone. Press next, and then you'll be taken to where you want to store your code. I'm going to store mine on the desktop. You can put it wherever you like. I just keep it on the desktop for convenience. And just make sure that your source control create git repository checkbox is unchecked. Click create and the project will be created for you. So you may be familiar with the project from going through the book or going through the other videos, and you'll see that it's very familiar. It's got an app delegate, it's got a storyboard, and it's got a view controller. So what we're going to do is we're going to edit the storyboard next, and we're going to edit the storyboard to add a text field control to it. To add a text field control, the controls palette is here on the bottom right hand side, and you can go in here and you can search for the text field, or you can just type in text field like so in the search window. So we'll take the text field and just drag it and drop it onto the design surface and make it about this size, leaving a bit of space on the right hand side. In addition to that, add a button which you're going to place to the right of the text field like so, and change its caption to go. I changed its caption using the attributes inspector here. I could have also done it by double clicking on the button and typing directly like so. And then in addition to that, we're just going to add a label. Again, we can just search for the label here, and I'm going to drag and drop it underneath the UI text field, drag it out something like this, and then I'm just going to change its caption to say output will go here. So now we have the basic application UI set up for us. So the next thing is to start wiring up the actions and the outlets for this. So we wire up actions and outlets using the assistant editor. So I'm going to open up the assistant. I'm just going to close the sidebar just to get a bit of space, and then open up the assistant. And the assistant tends to default to viewcontroller.m. You just want to make sure it's on viewcontroller.h, because when we wire up the outlets and the actions, we do want that to go to the header file. I'm just going to make a little bit of space so that we can see it a bit more clearly. Okay, here we go. So what do we want to do? First of all, the text field, let's do the label first. That's the simple one. So we'll start with the label. In code, whatever we in our app, what's going to happen is whatever the user types in here and then they press go, that text will appear in the label. So in code, in order to be able to address the label, we need an outlet for the label. We do this by holding down the control key and dragging over onto the .h file in the assistant, making sure it's under the interface word, till we get this UI where it says insert outlet or outlet collection, and then we drop it and we get an outlet. Connection, we can need this one, we can drop it as an outlet or an outlet collection. Because it's a label doesn't have an action, so it's smart enough to say it's only going to be one of these two. So we're going to create an outlet and we want to give it a name. I'm just going to give it the name LBL for label output. So I've now created LBL output as the outlet for this label, so I can address this label using underscore LBL output in code. So the next thing is the button. Let's create an action for the button. So, when I drop the button on here in the same way, you see I now have action as an option on the connection type, because a button can have an action, a label couldn't, which is why I didn't see it earlier on. So the action has an event, and the event triggers the action, and then the button supports a whole bunch of events. And as we explained earlier on, the best one for the button is for touch up inside. This was in one of the earlier chapters. So I just want to give it a name. I'm going to say go pressed. So that's telling me that I've created an action, go pressed. So whenever the user presses the go button, go pressed will actually get called. Okay, so finally, and the last thing that we want to do is cut. So yes, then of course what we want to do is create an outlet for the text input. So whenever the user, when in our go pressed function, we want to read what the user has typed into the text box and write it into the label box, so into the label. So I'm going to drag it and I'm going to drop it. I'll just drop it under interface so our properties are together. And my connection is an outlet, and I just want to call that txt input. So I've now created my user interface and I've wired up outlets for the text box and for the label, as well as an action for the button. So the next thing is let's go into viewcontroller.m and start writing the code for these. So if I select viewcontroller.m, I can leave the assistant open. I find it sometimes handy to have the .h and the .m side by side. But of course, if you want, you can close the assistant and get the full width for the .m file. But I'm going to leave it open for now. And we'll see that goPressed has been created for me. So what do we want to do with goPressed? So as we said earlier on, the point of goPressed, what it's going to do is take whatever the user has typed into the text field and write that into the label. So the label was called LBL output, as we can see here. So I want to address that, and I address it, as you recall, by beginning with an underscore. And as soon as I type an underscore, now the user interface starts taking a look at what it is that I might want to be using. And the first property that I had defined, the first outlet that I defined in my header file was txt input. So it took a guess that I want to do something with txt input. It was close, but what I actually want to do is something with LBL output. So as soon as I type the letter L, it realizes it's not that one and takes the next best guess, and that is LBL output. So I want to set LBL output's text property to be the same as the text property of the txt input. So txt input dot text, like so. So now it's a case of whenever the user presses the button, the label output text will become whatever was typed into the txt input. So let's run that and take a look. So if I go to the text field and I say hello readers and I press go, now hello readers gets entered into the label as exactly what we'd expect. Now if you've used an iPhone, you know that you have a keyboard on the iPhone as well, and you might expect, if I say for example hello from keys, that pressing the return key would also have the action, but it doesn't. Why is that? Well, the main reason is because the only place that we've put the action to happen is on the go button. We haven't done anything with the keyboard at all. So then in the next step in this video, we'll see how to do that. And this is using what's called a delegate to be able to do that. So let's go back to our code and take a look. So in real life, when you delegate work to somebody else, what you're really doing is you're asking them to do something for you. And you'll usually do this in a scenario where it makes sense to do so. Maybe they're better at doing it, maybe you're too busy, maybe it's just the right thing for them to do it. In programming, it's very, very similar. One object can delegate work to another object, and this is usually done when it makes sense for the one receiving the work to actually do it. So in this case, what we want to say is that our text field, when we put the cursor into the text field, the keyboard appeared. But what we want to do is say, wait a second, it doesn't make any sense for the text field to manage the keyboard, because what happens when the user works somewhere else other than in the text field? We might want the keyboard to disappear. What makes sense is that for the view that is containing the text field, for the work of the keyboard to be delegated from the text field to the view. And as a result, then, if I'm doing other stuff in the view, then the view might decide whether the keyboard wants to be there or not. So how you set that up to begin with is that you have to tell the view that it can have stuff delegated to it from a text field. And you do that within the interface command to the view within the header file. And you do that quite simply by telling it it's a UI text field delegate. It can be a delegate of lots and lots of different things, and you just comma separate them here. But you use an angle bracket UI text field delegate here. So now you have told the view controller, buddy, any text fields on your view may delegate their work to you, so be ready for it. Now I do say they may delegate work to you because you could also choose as a developer that some text fields don't delegate and some do. But we'll just keep it simple and we'll say, for this case, we are going to delegate to it, and we do that back in the implementation file by simply issuing a command like this. So our text field was called txt input, and we tell it what its delegate is. And this syntax might look a little confusing at first, where if I say txt input.delegate equals self. Now, to an English reader, it almost reads like the txt input is delegating work to itself when we say self like this. But in programming speak and in Objective-C, when we use self on a view, we're actually referring to the view. So in this case, txt input.delegate is the view because self is referring to the view, not to the subject of the sentence, which is txt input. It's actually referring to the actual view itself. So now we say if we do this, now any work for the UI text field can get delegated to the view. So, the view itself has to implement a function for handling stuff on the UI text field. And one of those things is, what should we do when the user presses return on the keyboard? So if I come down here and I start typing bool, oops, and then text field, I press T for text field, and now you see there's a whole bunch of types of functions that the text field can do, or that the view can do, that the text field has delegated to it. And the default one that comes up here, and it's the one that you most commonly use, would be text field should return. Whoops, it timed out, so I'm just pressing tab to go through there. So what's happening now is in text field should return, if this returns something positive like a yes or a true or something like that, you've told it that the return key should actually do something. And the return key should return and dismiss the keyboard, etc. Well, not dismiss the keyboard, we'll get back to that in a second, but the return key should actually do something, and when the return key is pressed, this function should take it. So we say, okay, well, when the user pressed return, what we really wanted to have happen was the lbl output.text would be set to the txt input.text. I'm not a very good typer, as you can see. So now, when the user presses return, we've told the text field to delegate the responsibility to the view controller. The view controller has this function to accept that responsibility. Return is pressed, then we want to set lbl output.text to txt input.text. So if I run the app, and I go in here and I say hello readers, and I press return on the keyboard, now hello readers get set into the UI text field. But the keyboard's still there. What's going on? Why doesn't it go away? Well, that's the next step that we want to take a look at, and this is the concept of a first responder. So in iOS, when you want to enter text, the operating system says, I'm going to give you a keyboard. And the object that you're entering text into, that object is called the first responder. That object gets the first responder status for the keyboard. So if you want the object to no longer have the keyboard, all you have to do is tell the object to resign its first responder status. So if I come in here and my object that generated the keyboard, that caused the keyboard to run, was my txt input. So what I want to say here is txt input resign first responder. So now you're telling the txt input has first responder status for the keyboard. You're telling it to resign first responder. And if nothing else has first responder status, and in this simple app nothing else will, that means the operating system says, oh, nobody needs the keyboard, and it dismisses the keyboard. It makes it go away. So if I run, we take a look, and if I now say hello, and I press return, now the keyboard goes away and hello goes into the text field. And if I say hello world, and press the go button, hello world gets put in here, but the keyboard isn't dismissed because within the go function, as you can see here, we didn't resign first responder status. So that's how you would dismiss the keyboard within, if you need to, or if you don't need to, within an iOS application. Now let's take a look at where this is very, very useful is if we start thinking about, particularly delegates, if we start thinking about what happens if we have multiple text fields on this, or text boxes on this view. Now we could write this code in every single one of these text boxes, but by being able to delegate the text field should return to the view, we only need to write this function once and then delegate every text field to the view using txt input.delegate equals self. So then this function will be called when I press return, no matter which text field that I'm in. Let's take a quick look at how to do that. If I go to my main storyboard again, and if I just resize this so we can see a little better, I'm going to move this label down so that I can add a few new text fields. I'm just using copy and paste so that I keep the dimensions the same. Let's say I create 4 of them, like this. And now I need outlets for each of these. So just resize things so we can see it a little cleaner. Okay, so I had txt input was the first one, so I'm going to do a bit of lazy programming. Control, drag, oops. I'm going to, actually I think, yeah, I made a little mistake. I just need to go back to fixed. I'm going to call this txt input 2. When I actually dragged this and dropped it on this existing outlet, I overwrote the outlet for txt input with a reference to this control. So now this one would be broken. So I'm just going to delete this and then recreate it over here. It's one of the things you just have to be a little bit careful of. It's a very subtle way that bugs can be introduced into your app. So txt input is there. Txt input 3 is there. And txt input 4 will be this one. So I've now created the outlets for the additional 3. So what I need to do then is to go back to my viewcontroller.m and make sure that they're delegated. So if I say txt input 2.delegate equals self, txt input 3.delegate equals self, and txt input 4.delegate equals self. So now these txt inputs will delegate work to the view controller, and this function should come in and take over and copy the output for them. But can you spot the deliberate bug? The eagle eye among you may have spotted it already, but I'll show you. Here within the text field should return, I refer to txt input directly. Right, so I always set the lbl output.text to txt input.text. And as you know, txt input was my first field, but I now have 4 fields. So what should I do if the user has put into txt input 3 or txt input 4? I can't keep saying, oh, if txt input 1 or txt input 2 or 3 or 4, both here and here. What should I do? Well, the designers of iOS thought about that ahead of us. And they said, look, there's a reference to the UI text fields that generated the return, and I'm just going to call that text field. So whichever text field that I was in when I pressed return, a reference to that is here. So by using this reference, whichever of these text fields or these text boxes we've put it in, then we can have a reference to it there. So we don't need to say txt input.text here. We can just say text field. And even though we haven't created anything called text field, this reference generated for us by the delegates is a pointer to the actual text field that it happened in, and it will just work for us. So it's a really nice handy little shortcut, and it's part of the concept of pointers that as you learn development they can be very, very useful, and pointers tend to be prefixed with little stars like this up here. So, and you can see that the UI text field star here tells you that it's pointing to a text field. So there's no actual text field called text field, just this text field points to an existing text field, and it's going to be one of these 4. So now we can go and we can run the application. And if I go into any of these and I say hello and press return, now the hello will get loaded into that one. This is label 3. Sorry, this is text field 3. And press return, and we'll see that the delegate function handles it perfectly, but the go button doesn't, because the go button is just wired up to this one here, to the lbl output. Go pressed says lbl output.text equals txt input.text. And this also demonstrates a little bit of a useful design pattern, that when you start thinking in terms of delegates and having a delegate function to handle it, think about how difficult the code would be for this go button for managing all these different text fields. And it's also a hint that that's the wrong way of doing it in iOS world. So The right way of doing it is if you delegate to the view controller, then you can handle things in one place in the view controller, and you can use the first responder status the way you're supposed to use it. And with that, that's our demonstration of using delegates to manage these text fields. And there's a lot more detail on this in Chapter 5, and I hope this sample was useful to you.